Hi everyone, this is Josh Go from National Taiwan University. Making good decisions should be of utmost importance to our brains. In this talk, I examine some recent findings from our lab about how our decisions might be affected by factors such as our age and cultural backgrounds. Suppose I presented you this stake in which you had a 90% chance to win $100 from me with a 10% chance you have to pay me $100. Would you accept such an offer? I think most people would. What about a 60% chance you would win $10 with 40% chance you pay me the amount? Most people would still be okay with this. Suppose now you only had a 20% chance to win $10 and an 80% chance you have to pay me $10. You probably would reject this offer. Now, let's up the stakes. What about a 22% chance of winning $1,000 with 78% chance you had to pay me that amount? Even more people would say this is a losing gamble and reject this outright. Okay, what about this? 46% chance of winning $1,000 and 54% chance of losing it. Not so clear now, is it? Mathematically, this is a losing gamble. Yet, at least some of us feel like we should not reject this offer, at least not so quickly. Indeed, in 1979, Kahneman and Tversky documented how humans don't really follow math in our decisions. Some other factors seem to matter as well. One such factor seems to be our age. Simonis, Larkin, Mathers, and a few others have shown that older adults have different risk preferences than younger adults. We suspected that this might have to do with differences in the way older adult brains respond to different stakes and expected values. To examine this, we made 40 young and 40 older Taiwanese older adults do a mixed lottery choice task in the MRI. These data are published in Neurobiology of Aging. In the lottery choice task, or LCT, participants see many trials of choices, like in the examples I just showed you above, except that they play for points instead of dollars. Participants then decide whether they want to accept or reject each given offer, after which feedback about outcome is provided. I won't talk so much about the feedback here, except that the task is set up so that feedback does not matter, and decisions should be based on stakes presented during the choice phase. In the table below, here, the different ranges of probability of winning are shown from the left column, LL, or low probability of winning, which is simultaneously very high probability of losing, to the right column, HH, or high probability of winning. The different ranges of high to low points magnitudes are shown from top to bottom rows. Overall, there are 15 discrete combinations of choice conditions with different expected values. As can be seen, across high, middle, and low magnitudes, participants have low acceptance rates for stakes with low probability of winning and high acceptance rates for stakes with high probability of winning as expected. However, note that at middle and even high magnitudes of points, while young participants have close to zero acceptance rates for low win probability stakes, older adults show acceptance rates around 20%. This means that for stakes in which you have 90% chance of losing 100 points, older adults are accepting such offers 20% of the time. We can further model participants' acceptance or rejection binary responses using a logistic function. With this function, we can then estimate each participant's threshold expected value at which they switch from rejecting to accepting stakes. In this example, subject A has a decision threshold of 7.14 before he or she generally accepts. In contrast, subject B is already accepting stakes even if the expected value is around minus 8.90. Thus, we say subject A is more risk-averse, while subject B has a more risk-taking preference. These violin plots show the 40 young and 40 older adult decision thresholds in our study. Older adults had a much wider range of decision thresholds, with a mean that was negative and lower than in younger adults, indicating greater risk-taking. In contrast, younger adult decision thresholds were around 0, rather neutral. This age difference remained even after accounting for the skewness using the square root function on the decision thresholds. What about how their brains were responding to the stake values presented during choices? Well, brain responses to different magnitudes of points did not seem to differ much across age, so we won't talk about that here. But when we examined where in the brain young and older adults showed sensitivity to win probability during the task, this is what we found. Younger adult ventral striatum, the region known to be sensitive to reward, lit up, along with right inferior frontal gyrus. For older adults, however, we saw a vastly different response across medial, temporal, and ventral medial prefrontal areas as well as bilateral dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex and dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. Note that the dorsolateral and dorsal-medial prefrontal areas are colored in blue, indicating a negative going response, as opposed to the orange colored areas indicating a positive going response. I will show you more details in the next slides. Focusing now on the ventral striatum. In young adults, we found increasing neural activity as probability of winning increased. In older adults, however, ventral striatal responses seems not to differ across winning probability or losing probability for that matter. Instead, older adults coded the increasing winning probability trend in their medial temporal and ventral medial prefrontal regions. Younger adults might have coded a U-shaped response to do with uncertainty, but we won't talk about that too much here. Here's the starking finding, moving to those blue-colored areas, the dorsal lateral and dorsal medial prefrontal regions. Here, older adults showed negative going responses in relation to probability. Specifically, older adults show higher responses in these brain areas as the probability of losing increased. We submitted the brain response data to a parallel mediation analysis of the effect of age on decision thresholds. This revealed that the effect of age in lowering decision thresholds was mediated by the level of sensitivity of neural activity in the ventral striatum and bilateral dorsolateral prefrontal areas. Digging deeper, we found that functional connectivity during the lottery choice task between the left and the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex mediated the effect of frontal striatal resting state functional connectivity and decision behaviors, and that this whole mediation was modulated by age. In summary, age differences in how the frontal cortex communicates with the striatum at baseline might determine how frontal hemispheres communicate with each other during decision tasks in older adults. This then leads to age differences in risk-taking behavior. This is speculative, but we think that higher dorsolateral prefrontal activity to losing stakes in older adults might indicate higher regulation of the negative affect to do with losing, releasing older adults to be tempted more by gains despite the likely losses. In sum, we found that older adults accepted more losing stakes than younger adults. This can be reframed as greater loss aversion with age. Such age-related loss aversion was mediated by less distinctive value-related neural activity in the ventral striatum and higher dorsolateral and dorsal medial responses to losses in older compared to younger adults. Such a neural response pattern might further be determined because of age-related effects on the baseline functional connectivity between frontal and striatal areas. Are all older individuals alike then? Well, no. We applied the lottery choice paradigm on 173 older adults to see the range of older adult responses using this task. In this case, the levels of probability and magnitude were reduced, albeit the range was roughly kept. Note that this sample was acquired in the US. This data are published in Journal of Neuroscience. We found that there was a skew with at least 1/3 of older adults with more risk-taking preferences. At least 1/3 of older adults also showed risk-averse preferences as well. In this case, greater risk-taking corresponded with higher neural activity to losing stakes, shown in blue lines in medial frontal, medial temporal, and striatal areas. By contrast, greater risk aversion corresponded to higher neural activity to winning stakes, shown in red lines in these brain areas, in these same brain areas. Thus, while older adults show greater loss aversion as a group, there are still substantial individual differences in older adults' risk-taking preferences. And these correspond to differential neural sensitivity to value across frontal, striatal, and medial temporal areas. We then asked, what might drive such individual differences in the neural processing of value? To answer this, we looked at our data collected in Taiwan, focusing on the young adults, and examined associations with differences in personal ideals about life in general. That is, we wondered whether how younger adults prioritize risk-taking and risk avoidance in life, as they consciously declared, would motivate their lottery choice behavior and accompanying neural processing. We expect these data to be accepted for publication very soon. The answer is that these personal ideals do matter in lottery choice decisions. Participants in our study also completed the Schwartz Values Survey so that we could assess their personal ideal for hedonism and security. Behaviorally, younger adults with higher hedonism showed higher acceptance rates than those with lower hedonism. By contrast, those with higher priority for security showed lower acceptance rates than those with lower security. Note that unlike the effect of age, which were for high magnitude stakes, the effects of such personal ideals in younger adults were somewhat more for lower stake magnitudes. What about the corresponding neural activity? Well, similar to the effect in more risk-taking older adults, we found that younger adults with higher hedonism who evince greater risk-taking for low magnitude states, I remind you, showed a negative neural sensitivity to value in the right dorsolateral prefrontal and striatal areas. Additional to this, we saw a general negative neural sensitivity to value in angular gyrus and visual regions as well. By contrast, younger adults who prioritize security or the maintenance of status quo reduced their neural activity as stake magnitudes increased in right orbital frontal and amygdala regions, and increased their neural activity in visual and other perceptual regions as choice value increased. We suggest these differential patterns of neural activity reflect differential computational biases these individuals engage when processing the value of stimuli they encountered with respect to their internal psychological predispositions. Indeed, when comparing the whole brain network of functional connectivities, or voxel-wise degree centrality, during the lottery choice task across individuals prioritizing hedonism or security, we found the following. Younger adults prioritizing hedonism showed functional connectivity hubs in the right insula and habenula, bilateral habenula, that is. We think this reflects how such individuals have less association of losing stakes with punishing or negative affect. By contrast, younger adults prioritizing security had functional connectivity hubs across bilateral insula, anterior cingulate gyrus, occipital, frontal, and supplementary motor areas. We think this reflects how individuals engage widespread communication of information between these brain areas when deliberating their decisions, which tend to be more conservative. Overall, the psychological personal ideals that individuals adhere to correspond to their risk-taking behavior. Specific to the pursuit of hedonism or security, these two polar ideals to do with personal ideals are reflected in distinct patterns of neural engagement during decisions to do with risk and reward. Might such personal ideals have bearing at the scale of societal cultural contexts, with several individuals seemingly subscribing to similar psychological motivational ideals for decision processing? Well, in collaboration with Angela Gutches at Brandeis University in the Boston, America, USA area, we are now collecting cross-cultural samples undergoing the lottery choice task fMRI experiment. To date, we have additionally 40 more new young Taiwanese and 37 young Americans. It is worthwhile to mention that experimental and MRI protocols at Taiwan and Boston sites have been specifically matched as closely as possible in this project so that site differences are restricted only to low-level visual intensity differences across MRI scanning site setups. Here are the preliminary findings, which we hope to submit by the end of 2020. Some background information on the sample first. The US and Taiwanese young adults show typical Schwartz value survey patterns. The US group score higher than the Taiwan group on hedonism. The Taiwan group scores somewhat higher than the US group on security. We also compare the degree of social support across cultures as we thought this may bear on the level of security and risk-taking. However, at least when using the Social Support Questionnaire, the SSQ, it was surprising to us that American young adults listed more persons they could count on in various times of need compared to Taiwanese young adults. Anecdotally, it might be important to note that Taiwanese might be more restrictive in their social definitions of persons they can count on relative to American young adults. We are still looking into this data to see if this makes sense. For now, we report that young Taiwanese in this sample showed higher acceptance rates for middle probability stakes compared to young Americans. Note that this is for high magnitudes, so this is distinct from the effect of personal ideals earlier, which was more for low magnitudes. What about their brain responses? While on the left part of the slide, we see a replication of the ventral striatal and right inferior frontal positive sensitivity to increasing value as before, but in this new young Taiwanese group. That's a nice replication. But we see drastically different patterns in the American young adults who show more negative sensitivity to expected value across frontal and temporal areas. Specifically, as seen in the right part of the slide, American young adults showed significantly higher neural activity to lower or losing probability stakes compared to Taiwanese young adults in the supplementary motor and anterior temporal areas. Note that these are different from the areas that older adults showed in the earlier study. Thus, these culture-related differences in behavioral and neural response during the lottery choice task appear to be distinct from the effects of personal ideals and age to do with hedonism and security. We think that such differences across Taiwan and US young adult samples might reflect deeper deliberation between young adult self-related goals and the broader cultural social expectancies. We are examining the data more deeply to find support for this notion. At this point, I will return to the view that the brain is very much prioritized to make good decisions. If good value-based decisions can be defined by the equation for expected value, which is the sum of the products of probabilities of utilities, M, then the brain and resulting behavior should follow the math and truly the physics underlying related mechanisms in the universe. However, in our reality, mathematical expected value is not the only information that the brain receives about events. More local cultural contexts, including the approving or disapproving signals of peers or historical records, also accompany the total sensation impinging on our brains. Importantly, our brains are by no means neutral receptors of such sensations. It contains the current status of physiological functioning, like, for example, aging, as well as self-related biases in information processing accumulated over life experiences within specific cultural contexts. As such, computations to specific decision behaviors and the accompanying neural activity reflect a sort of cascade of predictive decisions and actions in response to given environmental stimuli sensed by the brain, qualified by its physiological, functional, and self-related biasing computational constraints. With respect to this symposium on cultural neuroscience and mental health issues, I suggest that a Bayesian approach towards evaluating the specific roles of cultural and self-biases and their conflict might yield interesting therapeutic insights. I am happy to discuss this notion more in the discussion later on. That is all I have for now. This work is funded by the Taiwan Ministry of Science and Technology, the National Taiwan University Hospital, and the National Institute on Aging in the US. Significant mention should be made for my lab, especially Yuxiang Su, Jiquan Chen, Junyi Li, and Yunxuan Zhuang, who have made primary and critical fundamental contributions to the findings highlighted in this talk. Thank you.